On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Randy Bean. He is an advisor to Fortune 1000 CEOs in data-driven leadership for the last 3 decades. He's actually a best-selling author. The book he's last written is Fail Fast, Learn Faster, Lessons in Data-Driven Leadership in an Age of Disruption, Big Data and AI. He's a contributor for Forbes, Harvard Business Review, and MIT Sloan Management Review. We're going to be talking about something right up his wheelhouse, an area about the evolving role of data and AI leadership, the challenges companies face in becoming data-driven, and what do companies have to do to deliver more value and build that data culture. Randy, thanks for being on the show.
Pleasure, Amir. Nice to see you today.
Absolutely. Likewise. Thank you for your time. And I guess, I did the overview, but it doesn't do you justice. You got a fantastic background. I'm excited to have you on. Tell us a little bit about, what you've done recently, just to kind of give some context of the conversation.
I've lived on all sides. I came out of industry, Fortune 1000, top 10 bank, a number of years there. And I was trained as a COBOL and assembler programmer, but I was more interested in the data that you move around. And after that, I went with a company that was a pioneer in database marketing, which today would be known as CRM. It was all about helping companies understand how they could leverage their data to keep and grow their customer relationships. And then in the internet era, I went out to Silicon Valley and did 2 venture-backed startups as a co-founder before launching my own business in 2001, New Vantage Partners, where we were advising Fortune 1000 companies on how to leverage data and analytics to be more effective organizations, to build a data culture within their organization so they could take advantage of the data that they had and to innovate in their businesses. So that's what I'm doing these days. I sold my company in December of 2021 to a Paris-based global consultancy, Wavestone, who's on the Euronext exchange. So I'm on to my next chapter, and I'm working with them as a innovation fellow for data strategy.
All right. So I think you're going to deliver a great episode. It's in your wheelhouse. I'm super excited. I was thinking about this weekend, what we're going to be talking about. I have a background in BI and in your specific areas where I love to work in. And when I was working in technology, is this evolution of data and AI leadership, right? I mean, it's becoming, something of a much more complicated, complex organism. I actually draw the analogy. It's becoming more like, challenges people see in software engineering, where there's deep specialization, lots of moving parts, the complexity of the cloud. I guess talk to us about, at a high level, some of the evolution, some of these evolving roles of people that you see in data and AI leadership.
Yeah, well, traditionally the CIOs were responsible for data, hence their name, Chief Information Officer. But all of that changed following the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, particularly in banking, because there'd been a lack of accountability for financial data in particular. And so out of the regulatory demands, the chief data officer role was established. As a matter of fact, the first chief data officer for a major bank, in this case, Citigroup, had been a former partner and advisor in our firm. So we were really there from the outset. Now, originally the role started as purely a defensive role primarily, and it's evolved over time significantly also into including offensive capabilities around generation, creating new markets, attracting new customers, those type of activities. Not to mention AI, particularly in the context of generative AI coming under the umbrella. So the CDO role really expanded from the CDO role into a CDAO role, with the A being analytics. And these days it's a CDAIO role, with the A being for both analytics and the AI being for artificial intelligence. So it's really evolved in that regard from a defensive role to an offensive role. However, given the economic uncertainties this year, given the bank failures, given greater regulatory attention, many of the chief data officers, at least in financial services, have been pulled back into that defensive capacity.
I guess when you look at, and it's interesting, when you say, it started off defensive and it's become more offensive, I hear a lot of cybersecurity leaders when I have them on the show, they're starting to talk about that, and it's the evolution, I guess. And it's interesting that data's already gone through some of that. What are some of those offensive capabilities that you're seeing companies kind of embody and start to put into practice?
Well, traditionally, the roles were segregated in terms of a chief data officer and a chief analytics officer. But when organizations realized that it wasn't enough just to build a repository of data, you had to analyze this data, you had to develop algorithms that supported your business initiatives. Then those roles were really brought together. So it's gone from just organizing the data and cleaning the data to making use of the data. And that's where the analytics component has come in. Probably the biggest challenge organizations face now, and it's been particularly called into attention this year for the reasons mentioned in terms of the bank failures and economic uncertainty and layoffs in the industry, is that many organizations have invested in data and analytics investments, but they haven't necessarily seen the business returns that they need to see. So now suddenly there's an increased demand and increased pressure to demonstrate business value from data and analytics investments. There's been a significant turnover in the role from the beginning of this year for precisely those reasons, in part organizations reshaping that role and reshaping the expectations. And one of the consequences of that is starting to see more and more business leaders move into that role, as opposed to, say, subject matter experts or deep data and analytics folks. So it's really just part of the maturity process. So organizations are really starting to take a look at and figure out how data can become a component in every aspect of their business and how they can measure that at every stage of the investment process.
I think it's really interesting, and I think we'll stay with value and kind of come back to moving to data driven, as you were just mentioning value. I guess one thing that I kind of have just seen, and I'm curious to get your viewpoint, is a lot of companies that have emerged in the last decade, they are driven by data. They are they're driving revenue based on data. Data is their product, and we always hear about this productization of data, productizing data. Are legacy companies looking at that and going, we have a ton of data? I think I had somebody on from CarMax, and he mentioned they have data from every car almost you could imagine. They got half the data, or maybe more. Don't quote me on that. I'm not going to be quoted on that, but they have a lot of data, and they're realizing that there's power. And I guess when you alluded to delivering value and they're sitting on mountains of data, are they starting to look at that and go, hey, if these upstart companies, these unicorns, these recently public companies, these tech companies are all delivering productized data, we can do the same?
Well, absolutely. It's really been a quarter century since the introduction of the internet and digitally native companies, and those companies were born out of data. You take, for example, in financial services and organizations like Capital One, which is roughly a 25 to 30-year-old bank. Those were data and analytics folks that found a bank because they found a way to apply the data and algorithms. Now, that contrasts with most companies, most of the Fortune 500, Fortune 1000, who are legacy companies who have existed for generations, if not, well over a century. I've written recently about a 170-year-old company and a 185-year-old company. And, those organizations are severely challenged. They have tremendous volumes of data, particularly financial services firms, but also healthcare and consumer packaged goods companies. But change for those type of organizations is never easy. So when you have data and it resides in very disparate parts of the organization, there aren't processes that link together this data. There's not common leadership and responsibility for who owns, cleanses, and is ultimately the user of data. All of these are complex processes to change. And like any type of transformation or change effort, particularly with a large Fortune 1000 organization, it doesn't happen overnight. These little types of transformation tend to unfold over many years or even into the decades. So it's not surprising when I began my career, well over a generation ago, the notion at the beginning was, okay, we have this data. How can we gain insights into operating our businesses more effectively and more efficiently? That's still the same question that organizations are asking today. And it's not something that's been solved in the past generation. Companies are making progress, but as they're making progress, the volumes of data continues to proliferate. The technologies available continue to grow exponentially, and the digital environment has made this even more complex. So, it's definitely a journey, not someplace that organizations get to overnight.
I think you mentioned the challenges. I guess I was listening to the Ford CEO talk about the challenges they have in moving towards an EV environment. And he mentioned they have to source from about 150 vendors different electrical components to make the car work, and all 150 are written by the vendor, and they don't have necessarily all the rights to actually edit any of that code. It's complicated. And then you have a Tesla that has insourced a common core code base, and it's a little bit easier to make the car a piece of software as well. And Ford's learning how to do that. They're actually having to learn how to become a software company. I guess you mentioned Capital One. There are companies that are more forward on that process. They embrace the digital, the internet, side. They've become aware that they're not software companies, but they need to be a lot earlier on the technology side. You have some legacy companies that are getting there. When you look at the challenges that let's say a company at some stage still faces, and they could be different stage of that maturity curve, what are some of the high level challenges? I mean, it's again very complex. You could have legacy solutions. These technologies necessarily aren't round pegs, round holes. What do you see some of those obstacles of becoming data driven for most companies?
Well, my firm has been conducting a survey of Fortune 1000 data leaders, C executives for a dozen years now. So this year, 86% of the participants held the title of Chief Data and Analytics Officer in one of those permutations. And what shows up year after year after year, this year was roughly 86%, in some years it's been 90%, is it's all about culture, very little about technology. In other words, less than 10% say technology is a barrier, but culture, change management, people, change to processes, communications, all of those type of entities. I often tell the story of going into organizations, and I'll meet with the data team, and they'll talk about the capabilities that they've created, the models, the algorithms, and I'll say, this is very impressive work. I'll go and I'll meet with the technology teams that talk about the architecture and the platforming and the engineering they've conducted, and I say, this is nice stuff that you guys are doing. And then I'll go and meet with the business leaders, and I'll say, are you getting value from all of this work that's being done around data and analytics to support your requirements? And I say, well, there's a series of issues. First of all, we don't really trust and have confidence in the data that we're receiving. We're not receiving the data that we need to make the decisions that we need to make too often. And we're not receiving the data that we need in a timely fashion when we really need to make those decisions. So that points to, even though everybody's doing great work, it points to the disconnect and lack of integration of many of these activities. And what we find is that the most successful organizations actually start with the business and the business problem, and they move backwards into the organization in terms of building capabilities to support those specific business problems. And often that means that it may be narrower at the outset because they're just trying to answer a specific question with specific pieces of data. But you don't always need to create the Uber environment. You don't need to Uber engineer. You don't need the data to ask all questions because, not all data is created equal. And like anything, 90% of the business questions rely on 10% of the data or even less. So what's been happening to a certain degree is over-engineering or over-investment in infrastructure as opposed to starting with the specific business questions that organizations typically need to answer.
And it's interesting. I've been asking, I guess, the past few guests this question, and I think it might fit within the context of what you've done, your advisor, within the data leadership space. I guess I've been calling it technology FOMO, and there's such a fast, rapid, change of technology. The pace at which it's been evolving, something new seemingly is always coming out. There's always somebody around the corner with a new mousetrap that they feel they could sell you. And if you're a leader, you're looking at the business value. You're trying to stay ahead. You don't want to go out on the bleeding edge and make that mistake, but also you can't wait. And there's this delicate balance, I don't know if we call it R&D, but somebody who's paying attention. When you look at the data space, and I know AI is the conversation around data right now and what's happening, but how do you talk to leaders and leadership about that FOMO piece of that art piece of, hey, you wait, but don't be too early. You wait, you're too late. Seems very much a knife's edge type thing sometimes.
Yeah, for Fortune 1000 companies, which is really the bulk of where, there is big tech, which is now huge in terms of market value, but it's still relatively small in terms of the total number of companies in proportion to the Fortune 1000. So for Fortune 1000 companies, it's really about, the way I describe it is, you don't need to be first, you don't need to be second, but when there's a critical mass and critical mindset in terms of movement of the industry, you want to be well positioned for that. And it's just in the nature of larger organizations, given their size, their legacy, that they move slower. So they can afford to be more cautious. The thing that I often recommend for these organizations is to establish centers of excellence, analytic sandboxes, things of that kind, where they can test and learn and try out new capabilities. And as those capabilities gain adoption, they can bring those into production. I remember working with Wells Fargo Bank in the early 2000s, and Wells Fargo for a bank was located in proximity to Silicon Valley. So they were much more responsive at that time to this idea of the internet and digital, as opposed to, say, the traditional New York banks. And they had set up a center for excellence where they basically tried to migrate customers over time to the digital channel. Well, within a few years, 50%, over the majority of their customers were using the digital channel as their primary means of interaction with the bank. So that was something that was radically successful, really pointed the direction to where banks and so many companies, retailers, et cetera, have gone over time. So, going that center of excellence route is a good way to test and see if your customers, the market, is ready to adopt a new capability or whether they're not. Because for every new capability that's adopted on a widespread basis, like the digital and internet channel, there's many that just fall by the wayside.
I guess if you were to, and you might not know this, I was just kind of curious, as you kind of have seen the, I guess the more progressive companies establish the center of excellence, a sandbox for people to start experimenting in. Have you seen a tangible shift in how they've accelerated the adoption of becoming more data-driven, implementing more offensive capabilities?
Very much so. I mean, I think it's a characteristic of the digital era going forward and the proliferation of data and greater computing power that organizations do realize that they have to be more agile and technologically nimble. So I think centers of excellence and similar capabilities are well adopted or built in to most organizations now, including the largest companies. So I think every major company now has experimentation going on. I know that virtually every organization I talk to is experimenting with generative AI and large language models and where they play a role in their business, and also what are the concerns and safeguards that they need to ensure that are in place.
Awesome. I was going to ask you, I appreciate you coming on. Your background in this is fantastic. I think, you're the perfect person to speak to the subject. Before I wrap up, I was going to ask you one final question when it comes to data and AI leadership and kind of some of the trends you're seeing and what you're seeing out on the market. Have people started thinking about how they're going to identify projects that might be successful? Like, I guess, have they started to think about, hey, if we're going to implement something in the center of excellence, we need to be able to judge what that impact, the ROI, the benefits will be? Because obviously, when you're implementing something brand new, you don't have that baseline. You have to kind of make some assumptions. Has that been coming up more and more with newer technologies?
Yeah, I think we're at a critical juncture in that regard. It used to be a few years ago that when talked to an organization about a particular data and analytics effort, often you heard the refrain, "Oh no, not another data project." But organizations are coming to the realization that data, digital, AI, analytics, they're going to be critical components to their business. But at the same time, they just can't continue to invest without understanding what the return on investment is or will be over time and getting measurable results in the immediate term. That builds trust and credibility with the business. And one of the messages that I've given to various organizations, and I put it in the strongest sense just to kind of force a discussion, but what I tell them is, if you're not getting business value from your data and analytics investments, then you should stop those entirely.
What's out of curiosity when they hear that, and that's I'm sure that kind of flies in the face of what they're thinking. What's the reaction?
They tend to say, you're right. I mean, now we're at a stage where we've been investing for a number of years, but if we're not seeing the business value, if we're not able to tie measurable results to specific business questions and business outcomes, we shouldn't. We don't have the luxury in a period of economic uncertainty, layoffs, bank failures to continue to invest in good faith. We have to separate the nice to have from the need to have and focus on those initiatives that are need to have and only invest in those.
All right, Randy. I appreciate it. I think it's been awesome chatting with you. I guess before I let you go, I'd like to wrap up with these last two questions. If you could ask a future guest to cover a topic for you on the show to listen to, what would you like to hear about?
I think one of the biggest issues of concern that, don't hear organizations talk enough about is ethics and privacy, particularly data ethics or ethics in terms of use of data and use of artificial intelligence. And I know in the survey that we run, only 20% of respondents' organizations felt the industry was doing enough in terms of responsible ethics around the use of data and AI.
All right, that's a good one. It's going to be one that still will shake out for a little bit of time as we start, piecing together a lot of these different new technologies. And if somebody wants to reach out to you to cover, ping you on anything you've spoken about or anything at all, well, that's a good way of getting in touch with you.
You're always welcome to follow me and can reach out to me on LinkedIn at Randy Bean NVP. I published an article this morning on TIA's data, digital, and AI transformation last week on Prudential's similar effort. Or you can reach me on my personal email, rbean@randybeandata.com.
Awesome. We'll make sure we include some of those links in the show notes so people can find you and follow up with you. Randy, thanks for being on the show. Thanks for sharing.
My pleasure, Amir. Thank you.
Absolutely. That's it for this episode. Be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, if you know someone or you yourself have a background in ethics and privacy, in data, I'd love to have you on the show. I think we need to start talking more and more about that and need to cover it more. So reach out, let me know. I'd love to see if we could cover some particular topics. And also, if you did find this episode of interest and value, share it with somebody else. That's how the podcast has grown. Like, subscribe, comment, review, whatever you'd like to do. Find the channel you're listening to it and just help us out, because that is how we've grown. We don't promote it. It's all organic. And I think everyone does that. So until next time, thank you and goodbye.